the REST services, REST API validation. So simply like the REST API, when you are implementing the REST services, whenever we have a request body, we are applying the validations on the request payload. So what is required, what is not required, optional data, minimum value, minimum length, maximum length. So these are all values. So these are all validations. How to apply on the request payload, we understood yesterday, right? So it's a very simple, very straightforward. There is nothing to remember a lot of things with respect to validation. So we have to add validation, starter, and then what is the next step we have to do? Once we are adding starter dependency to our project, then our project is ready to support the validation constraints on the request body. Now, whenever you want to apply any validation constraints on request payload or request body, okay, so what is the annotation you have to use? @valid. @valid, where we have to use? Where we are using @valid? Along with request body annotation. Along with request body annotation, which request object we are trying to validate? Which request object we are trying to validate? So along with that, we are going to use @valid annotation. So if you are not given @valid annotation, now I will ask you one question. For example, I written all these constraints on the every property, but I did not given @valid. Now in this case, so here my point is the request body class contains the validations, but you are not given @valid along with the request body. So in such case, is it going to be validated? This request payload is going to be validated based on the rules and regulations we defined here. You got my point? You got my question? So I have payload. This is the payload class, right? Request body class. So I get given size, minimum, maximum, and everything here I given. So in this case, and I define this is what the REST service. So in this case, the request body is going to be validated or not. Validations available inside the class, but automatically the validation is going to happen? No, right? No, yes or no? No. If it is no, why? Yes, @valid. So whenever we given @valid, then only the validations coming into the picture. If you are not given valid means, even though inside class you written all the validations, minimum, maximum, all these things, those are all not affected. So that means you are just switching on, switching off the validation for that request payload for the REST service. Okay. So for example, assume you are using same request body in another REST service also. Maybe you are creating one more REST service, whatever it is. Simply I'm just telling the same Java, same Pojo class you are using as a request body for another REST service. First of all, can we use it? A same Pojo class can we use as a request body of for another REST service? Yes, we can use anywhere else. It's a simple Java class. Okay, so in anywhere else you can use that class. If you found like those are all properties are common based on the new REST service, you can reuse that class. Okay, we can reuse that class. Now in this case, so again, whatever the validation we applied for the user creation, customer creation. So if I want to make sure whenever this REST service is called, the validation should happen for this payload. Again, we have to give individually @valid. So that means each and every REST service level, whatever the REST service you would like to validate the payload of the request. So there you have to use an annotation called as @valid annotation you have to use. So if you are not using valid annotation, validations will not happen even though we are defined inside the class. Inside the Pojo class, we defined @size, all these things. Those are all not affected. So, okay. So just try that. If those are all really affected, then there is no use of giving it. Everything will happen automatically. So whenever you given, then only validation coming into the picture. Okay, fine. Okay, so whenever any validation is failing, what kind of exception we are getting? Anyone tried yesterday? Bad request is the status code. Have you seen what is the exception is coming? What is the exception? You are getting an exception. You are saying something like method arguments not allowed, something like that, right? So you just remember those things also. I mean, at least have an idea. I'll just show you one more time. Which one is ours? Security. Yeah, so we are not added anything in the user point of view, customer point of view. So what is this exception method argument? This is what I'm asking. Bad request, I know everyone will say. So internally what it is doing, it's a bad request. Simply it is not throwing the bad request. Along with an exception, it is giving a response as bad request. Finally, an exception is getting created in the backend or not. Whenever your validation is failed, any one of the validation is failed. If you observe here, so click on send. So what is this method? An exception is created by the Spring framework or not? Internally. So the exception is method argument, not valid exception. So that means simply it is saying like one of the constraint is one of the validation is failed. So what is that validation? Email is invalid format. In this case, email ID is a invalid format. Like that, whatever the constraints are failed, whatever the validations are failed, with all those messages, with all those properties, this object is going to be created. Which object? Exception object, method argument, not valid exception. Okay. So then finally you are receiving status code as a bad request after this exception. So if you observe here, method argument not valid exception, validation failed for the argument number 0, and they given which arguments for which arguments it is failed. Everything they are explaining as part of this exception. Customer details DTO is having 2 errors. Field error in object. Okay, one is called as name. Name is having very less amount of size. Default message size must be between 5 and 50. So those messages, whatever we saw yesterday here, same thing. The same exception is returned back to the client. Whatever the exception created at the server application. So this is exception or not? This is what I copy pasted. So this exception as it is copy pasted as a response to the client application with the status code called as, with the status code what? 400 bad request, right? So that is what 400 bad requests you got. Fine. So now we understood about how to enable the validations, how to apply the validation on a request payload. It's a very straightforward concept. Okay. There is nothing much to worry about it. Okay. Now next point here it is exception handling in the Spring Web applications. So what is the point here it is? Okay, so see here now, we are discussing a concept of exception handling in Spring Web applications. So what is the point here it is exception handling is generally, what is the exception handling? Generally, in general, what is exception handling in our core Java point of view? When we are going for the exception handling? Yeah, so generally, whenever we are executing any logic, when we are having n number of lines of logic, sometimes couple of lines may create an exception due to any reason. It might be arithmetic exception, it might be out of bounds exception, it might be runtime exception, it might be file not found exception, it might be null pointer exception. Depends on this scenario, depends on different situations. You are going to get different exceptions in our Java programming language level, right? So whenever you are writing the program with multiple lines, there might be a chance of getting most of the times different exceptions. When you are doing an operation on the null value, any operation, then what is the exception you will get? Null pointer exception. So similarly, assume you are doing some division operation. You got divided value as a 0. So okay, then you are going to get arithmetic exception. Assume you are trying to access. Assume you are having an array okay with values 1, comma, written with index 4 with this array. An exception, and you are going to handle that exception. How you are handling the exceptions? In Java, how we are handling the exceptions? Try catch blocks you are writing, right? So as part of try writing, we are writing the in Spring. What is the meaning of Spring Web Application? Here it is. So, for example, sorry, if when it comes to the exceptions, how many types of exceptions we will get generally? Generally, we have compile time and runtime. Okay, leave about compile time. When compile time exceptions you will get generally? What is the meaning of compile time exception? That exception you have to make sure handled while you are compiling your program itself, right? So whenever any method is throwing an exception, predefined methods or user defined exceptions, you have to make sure handling that exception 100% at the time of writing the Java file. And by the time you are compiling, that exception should be handled. Or it's handled in the sense you are handling in two ways. One is try catch, second one is throws. That means you are just throwing to the caller. So that is all a simple compile time. Leave about compile time. I want runtime exceptions. What are the examples for the runtime exceptions? Same thing, whatever we discussed right now also. Index out of bounds exception. Okay, or arithmetic exception divided by 0. So apart from that, file not found exception, class not found exception, method not found exceptions. So many exceptions, right? So you may get at runtime level n number of exceptions. It might be null pointer exception. And as of now, what is the exception we saw in this case? Method argument not valid exception. Method argument not valid exception. This is also a runtime exception or not? From the Spring framework. So like this, you may get so many runtime exceptions. Whatever you know, 3 to 4, those are all just from the core Java. But when it comes to the Spring framework, from Spring framework, we may get a lot of different exceptions. You know any exceptions from the Spring framework? What we learned from the core module, JPA module? Sorry? Yeah, unsatisfied dependency exception. Next, been not found exceptions, right? So that means Spring framework may produce different exceptions. So that means you are going to face n number of runtime exceptions when you are working with any Spring framework application. The exception belongs to core Java API. The exception belongs to Spring API. The exception may belongs to the Hibernate. The exception may belongs to the JPA, something, whatever it is. Somehow you are going to get a lot of runtime exceptions. Now, in this case, the point of exception handling here it is, assume when you are defining an endpoint, okay, with respect to REST API or maybe a standalone application or monolithic application point of view, a view layer integration, whatever it is, a controller endpoint methods. Simply, I can select controller endpoints. So when we are defining controller endpoint methods, as part of controller layer or service layer or repository layer, total we will maintain 3 layers to write down the logic to implement the logic for a requirement, right? So out of these 3 layers, are we going to get exception out of these 3 layers anywhere else or not? Sometimes we may get it controller layer. Sometimes we may get it service. Sometimes because of repository also. Okay. So we may get exception with respect to an endpoint execution, a REST service execution, right? So wherever you are getting an exception, somehow you have to handle that exception to display a meaningful message to the client. For example, if you see here, I'll create couple of exceptions. Okay, so I'm just going return. Okay, so I'm just taking the existing REST service. Okay, so what is city here? Path variable. What is gender? Query parameter, right? Request parameter. So as part of this REST service, we define two variables. I mean, one is path variable, one is query parameter. So in this case, for example, assume I made query parameter is optional. How to made it? Required. Required equal to false. By default true. So we are making it as false. Okay. So in this case, the gender is always required. Assume I'm removing this logic. Okay. So I just return I'm receiving city as part of the path variable, gender as part of the query parameter. I'm passing to which layer? Service layer, right? So now as part of the service layer, what you are trying to do here? So find city and gender. So you are passing gender value here. We may get, we may not get because what it is? It's an optional value. It's an optional value. Okay, let's send a request to this. Do you have any predefined service? Yeah, gender I have here. City is Hyderabad. User/info is it? Yeah, user/info/city. So this is the REST service or not? So can I send request now? So let's send the request. What happened? 200 okay you got. Now, for example, I missed the gender value because it's an optional value. I may send it, I may not send it. Okay, in this case also 200 okay you got. So now see what I'm going to do here. For example, if gender dot equals something like male, okay, equals ignore case male and gender dot equals ignore case female. So why I'm writing this line? Assume generally we are maintaining only two genders as part of our application data and all. So when gender value belongs to maybe male or female, then only you can send to the DB. Otherwise there is no use, right? So then what you can say? Return empty response, right? You can return empty response. The reason is when gender is out of the, they entered a different value. Assume they entered a different value something. Now in this case, let me restart my application. Assume I return logic like this. Now in this case, I'm going to get an exception or not, we will see. Okay, so here gender equal to male I sent. You got 200 okay with empty response. We don't have users. I think the table is deleted. Okay, male and Hyderabad you got fine. Now for example, if I missed the gender, what you got? Why? As per our requirement, gender is an optional value. Earlier we didn't get any exception. This time we got an exception. And what is the reason? What is this exception? Null pointer exception. Why null pointer exception? Because gender value we are not sending. When we are not sending, string value by default is null. On top of null, which method you are calling? Equals method you are calling. Equals ignore case method you are calling in the service layer. Now where you got this exception? In controller layer or service layer? Service layer, right? In service layer, we got this exception at this line. At this line, you are making an operation on the null value. So that's why you got an exception here it is. So here you got a null pointer exception. Similarly, tomorrow, assume you are writing one more REST service. New controller. So simple. We will get lot of exceptions here also, right? In Spring Web application also, we will get different kinds of exception. So here, just I will write down very quickly. REST controller @get mapping. Okay, so here public string get EMI value something. I'm not doing all the calculations. Simply, we are generating couple of exceptions. Okay, so assume you are having service layer, all these things. Okay, so assume you are having some request body, you are getting 3 parameters. I'm not writing everything, so I'm just taking else. So don't think too much about the principal, CMI, all these things. Think only in the exception point of view. Okay, so here what I will do, so not string, right? Integer value 1, integer value 2. I can return double also. Okay, I will take double. Okay, so in this case, if I'm sending request to this REST service, what is going to happen? You are going to get any exception? No, right? So because all positive values, there is no zero, something you are going to get everything as expected. Okay, so here after this Flipkart, get EMI something. Okay, so you got what? Some value you got. Successful value you got. Everything is fine. Assume somehow as part of your calculations, you received value 2 as a 0 value. Some reasons. You may got from the DB or it may and user entered as 0. Any reason it is. Somehow the value 2 became 0. But still you're doing the calculation. Now what is going to happen? Okay, so here you got infinity. I'll make like this also. Yeah, infinity, that is what. I don't want to worry about that is all. So now, save it. Send the request. What you got? Arithmetic exception. So that means my point here it is, at any point of time, is it a controller class? Is it a service class? Maybe in DB point of view, tomorrow it might be a database exception also. Something like table is not existed. Primary key value is missing. We are getting some exceptions or not. For example, when you are mapping entity object, if you are missing, yeah, here. Yeah, here. For example, assume email ID is a primary key. If you are not sending email ID, then automatically is it going to be executed? Then what is the exception you will get? Primary key value is missing, something like that, you are going to get an exception. The identifier value is missing, like that, you are going to get an exception or not? You got an exception? Yes. So that means here in this case, in a Spring Web application, the exceptions, the runtime exceptions, only runtime exceptions coming at which layer? Any layer. So that is what the point I'm trying to say here. It is controller layer. When you are writing couple of logics, lines in the controller layer, there also there might be a chance. So whatever the validation exception you are getting, that exception coming at which layer? Controller only, right? The bad request exception you are seeing, is it part of controller layer, right? So the service layer, right now we saw an exception, so null pointer exception. So in service layer, assume tomorrow when you are making, you are getting list of users here and you are doing out of, okay, for example, if you see here, okay, assume you are doing some calculations here and you return data dot get of 100 index or 1000 index. So in this case, I have really 1000 index. I mean, first of all, in my database, do we have 1000 records? I have maybe 7 or 8. So in this case, what you are going to get? Index out of bounds exception you are going to get it. So that means any reason, any time, you may get any kind of runtime exception. Now what Spring Framework is saying is, whenever you are handling with the exceptions, runtime exceptions in a Spring Web application, okay, so generally by default, what is happening? Client receiving this kind of error stack trace messages as a response. So can I say this as a response in a client perspective? So whatever received by the client, Postman is a client or not? Now assume tomorrow front end is calling same REST service with same data. So they are going to get this error message as a response at the front end implementation level. So as a front end team or whoever it is, whoever is calling REST service of this one, if they are getting response always like this in a bad scenarios, will they understand all this technical terminology? What's happening here? What is the null pointer exception and all? Think as a simple customer point of view also, a very non-technical person, are you going to understand all these things? So you should not say all these things. Simply you have to say like, for example, this is what exception? Arithmetic exception. You got because of one REST service point of view. So you just need to extract that reason and send as a response. For example, in this case, if I given a response like here, okay, so you got an exception because of the value is 0, we got arithmetic exception. Like that, I given one line of statement to the rest as a response with 500 internal server error. Then which is the best approach? This one, sending as it is, or we are refining this exception into a meaningful message and we are sending that meaningful message. Now in the overall of this exception, I will send like this. Whenever any arithmetic exception I got divided by 0. So whenever any arithmetic exception got, I will give you a response message like this. Please check values. Okay, values should not be 0. Something like that. I given a meaningful message now. So now is this the better response with 500 status code internal server error? Or I will feel like this 0 coming from the client. So then I may give 400 bad request also in this case. Or assume you are just leaving it as 500 internal server error only. Okay, now tell me, instead of displaying all these things, if you are displaying this and you are sending 500 and this message to the client, so which is a better approach? Sending as it is the error stack trace or refining the exception. Whenever an exception occurs, we have to send this message. If there is no error, there is no exception, then he will get the value, the result. Something like whatever, 1, 2, 3, 4, the actual result you will get. Whenever exception occurs, generally as of now, what is happening? He is receiving this value always. This value always he is receiving. Right? So we have to send like this. Now similarly, yesterday also, we received bad request exception with this method argument not found exception. They are giving all the information, but how? In a lot of technical manner in a Java language format point of view. Now this exception is going to the client application. The client application is might be a not that client application is a front end, a React application or any some other third party application, Python application or whoever it is. They don't know anything about the Java. So in the overall of this also, here they are saying like one is this is the problem. Why this exception created? Because of this reason. Second reason is email ID is invalid format. So these two details actually representing this entire exception. So now I will send response like this. Okay, so the response object goes like this with 400 bad requests. Now tell me, which one is a good approach? Sending as it is this entire technical details, or sending a meaningful refined response message or response object like this, size, name size. Yeah, name size must be between 5 and 50. Email value is invalid format, 400 bad requests. So this is the better approach, or this is the better approach? So obviously this is. So that means whenever you are working for real-time web applications in Spring Framework, whenever you are handling any runtime exceptions, you have to think always with respect to response oriented also, what kind of response is going back in case any exception occurred, in case any exception rises. So how the response is going back to the client, the entire stack trace, or you are refining into a meaningful message and you are sending only meaningful message to the client. Yes, that is what. So that is what the meaning of exception handling in Spring Web application. You got the point now? Writing try catches, those are also we have to do in the Spring Web application. But what is the meaning of exception handling in the Spring Web application? Sending a meaningful response message, response, I can say like sending a meaningful response object when an exception occurred as part of our Spring Web application functionality executions. Sending a meaningful response messages instead of the entire technical or the exception message, the exception object details. This is entire exception object or not? So instead of this, we have to send like this. Instead of, in this case also, instead of this entire information, I'm going to send like this. So is this the better approach? I mean, is this the better one? So this solution is better solution. You have to send always in a good scenario, bad scenario point of view. When exception comes, when exception not comes, you have to make sure the meaningful response always should goes to the client. So that is what we have to do. Now in this case, what Spring MVC framework is doing, Spring Web Module is doing, they given a predefined mechanism called as, first of all, is it available? Yeah. Okay. So now as part of Spring framework, they given already ready-made solutions to make sure whenever an exception occurs, now Spring Web Module provided a mechanism, okay, when an exception occurs. So now the concept is all at what time we are discussing, at what scenario, when exception comes, how we are sending the response. That is what the concept. When there is no exception, general the responses, positive responses, the responses whatever you will send, that will go back, right? So when an exception occurred at runtime level. So this is all I'm talking about the runtime level. Okay. At runtime level, if any exception occurred, so generally Spring will send a response with exception object. Sorry, I will write down like this. By default, Spring Web Module, by default Spring Web Module, when an exception occurred at runtime level, what it is doing, Spring will send response with exception object details to the client as a response with a generic status code or with status code. I can write down like this. So this is what happening as it is or not, as of now. So is it sending the actual exception object, the entire stack trace of the exception object is sending as a response to the client or not by default. Now at the same time, now Spring provided Spring Web Module provided a solution or a mechanism, whatever you can call. When an exception occurred at runtime level, what is the meaning of runtime level? When that REST service is executing, when that endpoint is executing. In between, if you got any runtime exception, okay. To handle those exceptions and converting those exceptions into a responsible response format. So we have to make sure whenever that exception occurred at runtime level, now Spring provided the mechanism converting that exception object. I mean, you are just going to handle that exception and you are making what? A responsible response format with meaningful status codes. So that means simple. Now I'll just start. We will take an example, then you will understand. So now in this case, two scenarios. One is when a request comes from the client. Okay. Now the request went to server. Now in server level, it reached to the server application. Now assume you sent for an endpoint. Okay. Whenever executing at server level, if no exception, what is the response will go? If no exception, then what is the response? The actual response, the original response, like list of users with Hyderabad city and gender, whatever you sent, you will see all the user information or something like no users found, something like that, right? So the actual response you will see EMI value 5,000, 6,000, okay, like that you will see the original response, the expected response. Expected response. In case any exception comes, exception occurred in between the execution of the REST service, whenever this request is executed and exception occurred, what you are doing as of now, what Spring is doing, sending exception details to client as a response or not? Yes. Sending entire exception details to the client as a response. But in this case, what we are trying to do now, we are going to override we have to send response anyway to the client. We have to tell to the client what is the problem. But here the entire stack trace is going. In this case, we are overriding this functionality or this default behavior with a meaningful, that's what, or custom messages, custom response messages with custom status codes. Okay, so somehow now Spring providing a mechanism whenever that exception occurred, we are going to handle that exception and we are going to make a meaningful response object. Finally, we are making a meaningful response object and that response object we are sending back to the client instead of all the technical details. That is what the concept of exception handling inside the Spring web application. Not like the regular exception handling try catches. You will write down try catches. In this case, sending a meaningful or client understandable response to the client level whenever any problem occurs. Okay, let's see how it is. Now, I will handle this somehow. I will not send this entire thing. I'll give you a client understandable or responsible, a meaningful message. I'll give you a response in this scenario. How I'm going to do that? So in this case, Spring Framework provided a concept called as exception handlers concept. And as well as Spring provided controller advice concepts. Controller advice also. Another feature I can call it as Spring Web Module. These are all comes under the only Web Module part of view. Spring Web Module provided another feature called as controller advice concept. So what is the meaning of controller advice? What is the meaning of exception handler? We will see here. So here the controller advice, this is an annotation. This is an annotation defined at class level. So that means when you are writing a class, we are going to use this annotation at class level. This is an annotation defining at class level. So that means now we are calling the class as controller advice class. Okay, so that means now I'm writing one more point. Controller advice class contains exception handler methods. So that means whatever the concept provided by the Spring framework as exception handler, so those exception handlers we are going to define along with the methods. Generally, I'll write down one more point here. Exception handlers is a nothing but a method defined inside a controller advice class. Okay, so exception handler is a concept. We are going to use it, create a method inside the controller advice classes, and that we are going to make some configuration to that method, and those methods we are calling as a exception handler methods. So let's take small example, then you will understand very clearly. Okay, so save all responses. Okay, so first of all, what we have to define here, a controller advice class or not. So controller advice class will contain exception handler methods. So what this controller advice class here it is. So the controller advice class is responsible for, I'll write down one more point. The controller advice class is responsible for handling exceptions occur at runtime of Spring web application, Spring web functionalities. So that means somehow we are going to make the things in the controller advice level, those automatically will be taking care at the time of runtime exception. Now you got arithmetic exception. For that arithmetic exception, you are going to write some solutions inside a class called as controller advice class. Okay, let's see here. Let's define a controller advice class now in our project. Okay, so what I'm doing, new package I'm taking. Yeah, controller.advice, or you can take something like exception handling, whatever it is. Exception dot handling. Package name. Finish it. Okay, so I'm writing a class. First of all, REST services exception handlers. So class name I just given REST services exception handlers. Now can we call this class as a controller advice? No. So you just need to add an annotation called as controller advice. Think controller. See, the same thing, REST controller advice. Yesterday one person asked, sir, what is the REST controller advice? You can use controller advice. You can use REST controller advice also. When you will go for the controller advice, what is the difference between controller versus REST controller? You know that response body and all, but especially when we will use controller, when you are integrating the view layer, right? At that time, can we use REST controller? Calling the JSPs? No, right? So that means same scenario here it also. You have an annotation called as controller advices. Okay. Similarly, you have one more annotation called as REST controller advice. If your application is 100% dealing with REST services, then what you can take? REST controller advice you can take. Your application is dealing with that view layer integration, JSP files, all these things, then you can go for the controller advice also. So when you are using the REST controller in our class level, generally what is the one line we eliminated? @response body, right? That is what we eliminated. If it is controller, we added always @response body to support it as a REST service, right? Same thing, controller advice or REST controller advice point of view, both. If you see here, so I will take as a controller advice point of view, we will see. So that both are same, REST controller advice also. See, a convenience annotation that is itself annotated with controller advice and response body. So that means if you are taking controller on exception handler method, which annotation you are going to use? Response body annotation. If you are taking REST controller advice, you no need to use response body along with the handler mapping methods. Okay, exception handler mapping methods. We will see that. Okay, so I'm just writing controller advice class here. Okay, fine. Now I got an exception of arithmetic exception. Right? So what is the exception I got? One example is arithmetic exception I got. So sometimes another exception is null pointer exception I got. And one more exception what I got? This is what we okay. Yeah, this is what. Bad request point of a validation failed. So you got these exceptions. So like this, how many types of exceptions you are going to get? Do you have any limitation here? No, any number of exceptions. Tomorrow you are writing a REST service, okay, where you are loading a file and you are opening that file. Assume that file is not there. So then what exception you will get generally? File not found exception, something like that, right? So any kind of exception you may get. Table not found or something like identifier not found. Okay, so something like when you are using optional object, when you are calling the get method, what exception you are going to get? In optional class, when you are calling the get method, if value is not there in that optional container, no such element exception. No such element exception. If value is there, then you will get the value. That is optional class, right? So that means you may get any kind of exceptions. So whatever the exceptions you are going to get, for every exception, you are going to handle in the controller advices and you are going to send a meaningful response message to the client. For example, with respect to arithmetic exception point of view, what you have to do here it is. So I told you as part of the controller advice, what are the methods we are writing? Exception handler methods. Now here, what you have to do is, let's write down first an annotation called as, again, this is also an annotation, exception handler annotation. I will give you that also here. So when we are calling a method as an exception handler method is, when a method is annotated with exception handler annotation called as exception handler methods. Okay, so what exception we are trying to handle here? Assume arithmetic exception. So as part of exception handler annotation, you have to define which annotation you are trying to handle. The dot class instance you have to provide. So I'm trying to handle arithmetic exception. So that means as part of this exception handler method, public, let me write down a method, public, okay, so see here, response entity of string. Why I am using response entity? So that means, see, coding wise, somehow it looks like the logic what you written in the controller class level. Okay, so you will understand. Handle arithmetic exception. So you can give any method name. It's not like that. Okay, and whatever the exception you are defined as part of the exception handler annotation, you have to pass that as a method argument. Okay. One small example after execution we will understand again. And for the current request also, HTTP servlet request represents the, whenever you received a current request, as part of that current request, any exception comes, especially arithmetic exception comes, this method will be executed. That is what the meaning of it is. Return new response entity please check values. Values should not be 0. And I'm saying like if you are sending the values as 0, Then assume problem from, okay, I'll write down a status code like this, HTTP status code dot, assume I'm writing internal server error only. Server is saying if you are processing the value 0, I am unable to process it. It is problem on my side, but you have to pass as a non-zero value, something like that. Okay, so if it is controller advice again, you have to make sure response body. So in this case, what is going to happen? I'll tell you. Very simple. Now, whenever you are loading your web application into the Tomcat server, or when you are deploying, when you are starting, okay, for these exception handler methods, also, okay, a handler mapping. We discussed a handler mapping concepts in the Spring Web Application workflow, right? Internally, it will make a mapping which HTTP method, which controller class, which controller method, everything is maintained by the handler mapping objects. Dispatcher servlet will contact handler mapping whenever a request comes. I got a request for this URI, is it available or not? Then handler mapping will say, yes, available inside this controller class, inside this method, available like that. Handler mapping is going to give the information. The same wise here also, whenever you define the exception handler method as part of the controller advice class, this is all created as a, this information is going to maintain in the Spring Web Application at runtime level. Now in future, wherever you got an arithmetic exception in Spring Web Application, whenever you are getting any arithmetic exception, internally what Spring Framework is going to do, nothing but dispatcher servlet, what it is going to do. Now for example, which a return, yeah, loan control. Now assume integer response equal to okay. So now I'm calling this REST service from the client. What is going to happen now? You got what? A successful, the actual response or not? You got a actual response in the backend, or you got any exception in this case? No, everything is positive values, everything is non-zero, you got everything is good. So now for example, assume somehow you can send from here also if you want to. I can made it something like 1000 comma 0. So can we make like this? Only thing is what you have to do then? You have to define path variables. At the rate path variable, at the rate comma, one more path variable. You can convert from string to integer value, and then you can do the calculation. Okay. So there are so many ways if you are thinking. Instead of hard coding here, that is what I'm trying to say. Okay. So assume somehow it is coming. The data coming, assume you can write down a request body also, or you just write down one more request body, like loan details, loan amount details like that. You can define a property, principal amount, time, as well as what? Interest, 3 details, right? So you just write those kind of examples. Okay. Now in this case, for example, assume somehow you got a value of 0 and you are trying to do with the division with the 0 value. Somehow the value became 0. Automatically, then what exception you are going to get in this case? Is it started first of all? Now what is this? Earlier what you got? You got the entire technical discussion, the entire technical details, the exception object, arithmetic exception divided by 0 like that. You got entire, the technical details of the Java language, right? You got as a response to the client. Now see, client received a meaningful or a client readable or client understandable response message we sent or not. So that means in this case, what is happening internally here it is, dispatcher servlet is executing EMI REST service. Yeah, get EMI or something, whatever it is. As an example, I'm telling you. Now, in this case, it is executing. It reached to the controller. Fine. Now, exception. No exception. I mean, from the dispatcher servlet, somehow the request went into the controller class. And there is no exception. So finally, what is going to happen? A response is going to be generated and given back to the client. The actual response. Expected response. Now, for example, exception created. You got some null pointer exception or arithmetic exception, something like that. Now, an exception occurred. Now, what is happening internally is whenever an exception occurred, immediately the information is reaching to the dispatcher servlet. Now, what dispatcher servlet internally doing? We already created some mechanisms. We already created a mechanism. We already provided a solution as part of what it is? Controller advices. So that means now divide it. Controller plus advice. Now what is happening? Response generating at which layer? Controller layer or service layer? The actual HTTP response will be generated at which layer? Controller layer only, right? Always. So now whenever an exception comes at controller layer, controller is realizing, okay, an exception created. Now it is going for the advice. It is going for the advice. That is why they given name as a controller advice. So now an exception created. Earlier you are not created any advices. That means there is no exception handling mechanism. So they given the name like that. Controller advice. Now you got the why they given annotation as a controller advice. So that means you are giving advices to the whom? Controller. With the concept, you are providing advices to the controller layer whenever an exception created. For that exception, you are saying this is what message users. This response you can send it to the. This response you can send it to the client. Like that, you are giving an advice. So now in this case, whenever an exception occurred, what it is doing? It is reaching to the controller advice. And what exception you got this time? Arithmetic exception you got, right? And in the controller advice, you handled arithmetic exception or not? Now controller advice is saying, yes, as part of controller advice, we are handling the arithmetic exception and this method is executed. Now what is happening? Whenever an exception occurred, then this message is executed. If there is no exception, controller reaching here, no, is positive scenario, service layer, repository, back, response. If exception occurred immediately in between the flow, exception created, what is happening? It is reaching to the controller advice. Do you have any advice or not? That means, are you implemented already with this exception? Are you having any solution or not? Yes, we have now. So that's why what you got this time? Meaningful response as a client. I mean, you sent a meaningful response to the client or not? That is what the point here it is. Now here the advantage here it is. For example, assume your requirement is demanding it has a bad request. Why? Client is always sending zero value. They should not send. So problem from client side. So can I make it as bad request now? Yes. See here, whenever this exception comes, I am giving a meaningful message as well as I am saying like it is a bad request. Okay, now let's send the request one more time. You got what? Bad request. Now my next point. For example, here you got an arithmetic exception. Now assume in some other controller class, in some other place, you got arithmetic exception. Then the same exception handler method, whatever you return now, is it going to be executed? Or the exception handler method, what we return now, is it only applicable for get EMI? You got arithmetic exception. Yeah, for example, assume candidate register, right? So do you have that? Yeah, okay. So I mean, don't think about it too much logic. Just assume if this logic you are getting at this exception you are getting at service layer. I'm not defining again one more service class and all. Integer result equal to 10 by 0. Okay. So now in this case, if I am executing this REST service, assume this you written in the service layer. Okay, I don't have service class. That's what. Assume. Just imagine like that. So this line is executed for this REST service. Somehow you are doing some age calculation or maybe some average calculations. Is marks you are calculating, some calculations you are doing. Somehow you got the arithmetic exception. Now if I am sending request to candidate / register, here you are going to get an exception. In the process of executing this REST service, you are getting an arithmetic exception. In this case also, the controller advice going to coming into the picture or not? Yes. So that means whatever the exception handler method we return, is it specific to endpoint or is it global to all the endpoints? Global, yes, global. Global means the exception handlers what you written as part of the controller advice wherever you are getting arithmetic exception, okay, so you are going to always, this will be executed. Always this exception method will be executed only for the arithmetic exception. Now assume you got somehow null pointer exception. Okay, I am leaving it. Now string result equal to, okay, null dot get something like length, sorry, size. Oh, sorry. Variable name I'm not taking. Okay, that's all. Okay, so what is the, just I'm printing the result length somehow, okay, whatever it is. Now tell me in this case what is going to happen. Assume this logic somewhere you written controller or service layer, wherever it is. Now whenever you are hitting this REST service, this time what exception you are going to get? So let's send the request. What is the exception? Null pointer exception you got. But are you handle the null pointer exception? No, right? So that means now in case if you want to handle the null pointer exception, whenever any any REST service level or any layer level, if you are getting null pointer exception, instead of displaying all these details, if you want to display a meaningful message or client understandable message, then what you have to do again? You have to define one more exception handler method with type null pointer exception. So arithmetic exception is dealing with only. So in this case, this method is executed only at the time of arithmetic exception. Now, if you want to deal with null pointer exceptions, you have to write down one more exception handler method. Okay, what exception you are doing? Null pointer exception. Okay, so here you can write down any method name, handling null exception, whatever it is. So what is the method parameter you have to define here? Null pointer exception. So what is the advantage of it is, okay, you can write down some lines here also. Why that exception is created. So see here, sys out of, in arithmetic level point of view, I'm writing. So the exception is nothing but what in Java? It is also an object or not? Right? Exception is also an object. Now see here, what I'm doing, exception dot. I'm printing some messages also. Why it got? So exception dot get message and sys out of request dot get context path. So you are printing the extra information at what time, for which request you got arithmetic exception, all these details. If you want to see the content also, you can print the content type, headers, get path info, something like that. Now similarly, I will write down this information also here. So this information is helping us now. For what is the reason of getting null pointer exception, at what, for which REST service we got that exception. You can log all those details here while you are sending the exception. Now tell me in this controller advice class, what kind of logic we are writing 100%? Is it exception handling method or not? Exception handling logic or not? 100% is exception handling logic with respect to web applications, with respect to Spring Web functionality. Okay, so let's send the request now one more time. You given null pointer exception, yes. Now this time it is going to handle only null pointer exception. Send it. What it is this? Okay, let me change it. Value is null. You know that. Okay, so what you have to write down on null, something like that. Okay, it's not started yet. So value is null, 400 bad request, something like that. You given a meaningful response back to the client again here also. Okay, fine. Now, for example, just see here what I'm doing. I'm commenting the, okay, let's go and verify what is printed in this console level. So for which REST service? Context path, Flipkart for the value null. Okay, so the reason is you are doing some string dot length, it came null. That is what you printed here, right? So like that, you can add some loggers, some printing messages. So those will help you why you got the exception. What is the reason At a backend application, as a backend developer, I can understand what's happening here. It is. So as a front end response point of view, as a client response point of view, you are sending a meaningful response. Okay, now tell me here. Now I commented the what? Null pointer exception. Okay. So in this case, what is going to happen again? You are going to see the entire stack trace. Okay, let's see here now. Okay, well, which exception I am handling now? What is the type? The parent of all exceptions, right? So I'm handling in this case. Now, in this case, what exception I'll get in this REST service again? What is the exception? Actual exception you are going to get? Null pointer exception. Now see here. What is this? Why you got null pointer? Actual exception created is null pointer. But it went to which exception class? Which exception handler method? The exception, whatever I written generic exception, it reaches there. Why? So that means yes, the same concept they applied here also. Whatever the core Java, you have a concept, right? For example, when you are writing the try catch in core Java, if you written here exception, so now as part of this logic, if you got arithmetic exception, it reaches to the catch block or not? If you got null pointer, yes. If you got out of bounds, yes, always. Because when you define a parent exception in the catch block level, it will go. For example, you define null pointer exception. Okay. So in this case, other than null pointer exception, if you got, the controller is going inside the catch block? No, right? So that means now, second point, how many catch blocks we can write down? We can write down many, right? More than one. Now in this case, I return exception, something like that. Now assume this logic created this time null pointer exception. Is it going to the first catch block or second block? First one. Now assume here you got some index out of bounds exception. Then it is reaching to the second. You got divided by zero exception, arithmetic exception. Second. So that means here the entire child exceptions are going to be handled by this catch block or not? Right? Same concept. They are also doing it. So when you return specific exception handler method, okay, now for example, if I'm calling the EMI, tell me, is it going to execute this body or this one? Is it going to execute this one, this handler exception method, or this handler exception method? You are getting arithmetic exception, priority given to the always the specific exception. If it is not there, then it will give priority to the generic exception. Generic means kind of parent exception, common exception point of view. Now here you are going to see value should not be 0. Okay. Now in case if I commented out this one also, first you got arithmetic exception. The real exception in the backend, what you got? Arithmetic. Then it is reaching to the controller advice. Are you handling anything for the arithmetic exception or not? No. But I'm handling for the exception. Then which block will be executed? Exception will be executed. So that means, so you can handle the much exceptions as much as possible. Okay. And if anything is missing, those things you can define as a global exception point of view. Those messages and all, you will see here printed in the format, or you can send a generic response. For example, assume I written like this. Currently, we are facing an issue. Please try after some time. Okay, now Okay, so now in this case, what exception I'll get, for example, so what exception I'll get here? Array index out of bounds exception. Are we handling array index out of bounds exception? No. So then I need to send request from the here candidate register. I written logic there. Yeah, here. Now what? Currently we are facing an issue. Please try after some time, and we are returning internal server error. Now server is saying you are good. Somehow I am facing some problem. Try after some time. We will fix it meanwhile that time. So now you understood what is the concept of exception handling in the Spring Web application. In interviews they will ask you how you are going to handle an exceptions which are created commonly in the REST services. So you have to tell them we have a global exception handling mechanism provided by the Spring framework called as controller advice classes. So it is a controller advice class. It is a REST controller advice. So if it is a REST controller, you don't need to go at the right response body. Same concept here also. So we are going to have a mechanism of controller advice class. Then you need to tell them inside that class, we are going to write down the exception handler methods. What is the meaning of what is the concept of exception handler methods? The method which you annotated with an annotation called as @exception handler. So as part of exception handler, which exception you are trying to handling, the specific exception you have to define that. And as well as that, the method body, what you have to return always? A response entity object you have to return. Why you need response entity always? So this logic is converting as a response. The body, whatever you are returning here, this is all converting as a response object, and this response object is going back to the client. This response is going back to the client. If you are not writing response entity, any problem? If I am not going to write down response entity, any problem? No problem when you don't have any custom status codes. You can return directly also. Only thing is, you cannot send any custom status codes, something like that. That's all. You cannot send any. Only thing is, this will go and you will see some 200 okay there always. That's all. Otherwise, there is no problem. So simply that's why we will always redefine when exception comes in the sense, definitely we will handle with respect to what is the problem also. Is it a server error? Is it a client error? What is the problem? Based on that, we will define the status codes also. So you got the point of exception handling in the Spring Web application now. So controller advice classes, exception handler methods, you have to write down. So how many controller advice classes you can write down? How many controller advice classes we can write? We can write down any. Simply, you felt like, okay, already 10 exceptions I handle here. Let me write down one more controller advice. And for another exception handler methods or something like that, you can create one more controller advice also. There is no limitation for that. Inside one controller advice, how many exception handler methods you can write down? You can write down more than one. Okay. So you got the point, right? Now, even in interviews, they will ask you. So this hierarchy also you should know. When specific is there, when generic is there, you got an exception of specific. So is it going to execute specific exception handler method or the generic exception handler method? Specific one, it will be executed. Now, next point is, I'm not taking this example, you just try. It's already there in the material also. Okay, if you want, you can take the help. Nothing else. So here, what is this? Method argument not valid exception. In this case, what happened? Entire thing's going back to the client. Entire thing coming back to the client. So in this case, what is the exception handler method you have to write down? Tell me. Yes, this exception. So here, what exception is created? Method argument valid, not exception. So in this case, in the controller advice class, just create, I'm not writing. It's there also. So just what it is, that's all. Import the package. Okay, now for the current request. So here you are going to extract. This logic is there in the material also. You just write. Only 10% you have to keep your efforts. Return type of list of string messages I'll get. Exception dot get all errors, detailed messages, something like that. You are already having everything here. Get field errors. No. I'll tell you from here only. So inside this object, codes, errors, get errors, I think. Exception dot get field errors dot get. So this logic is there. Only thing is just you need to get all errors. Then you will get list. See, it's a exception object. And nothing but this is a class. Method argument not valid exception is a class. So internally it is having a lot of methods. Okay, those methods are going to contain those validation error messages. Only thing is here you need to call that respective methods. Can you give you? You just try that. Only one method is there. I forgot it. So I think get all messages only. All error, field errors as a list you will get. From that, yeah, I think this one only. Even I can do one thing instead of all this. What is the return type? List of field errors. So I written this logic. We are out of the time. Okay. Only one or two lines. Only thing is nothing. See, this is what the overall is exception object or not. So inside that object, you are having data. You are extracting the data by calling the predefined methods. So you are handling that. You create it as a method parameter. Only thing is now you will return these errors from here. That's all. So the string errors, if you take in as a finally you'll get a list of errors from here. You can convert one by one. I mean, you can get all the errors from here. A list will be created. That errors you can return from here. Errors, comma, bad request, something like that. Okay, so that is all you have to do. Just one or two lines is there. It's there in the material also. You just understand what you are doing. So this is a class. Exception is nothing but what in Java? Class only, right? Exception created in the sense object only created, but a separate section of classes, exception classes. When exception created, exception occurred, you got null pointer exception. What is the meaning of getting null pointer exception? Object is created. Somehow it is also a class. An object is created, but it is working as a exceptional oriented. That's why we are calling it as exception classes. Okay, you just try this. Then you will not see this entire stack trace. Whatever you are returning list of errors, list of string errors, which are extracting from all the field errors, those will be displayed as a list. That's all. You just refer the material, you'll get it. Or else I'll take this example tomorrow also. Okay, so any doubts? Give me a moment. If I want to handle all exceptions, then what should I do? See, and one more point. It's not like every time you are going to write down the exception handler method for every exception. You have to see the fundamental. I'll tell you in the real-time project. What you have to do is you have to make sure writing, avoid writing, I can tell like this, avoid writing exception handler methods as much as possible. As much as possible, we should not write exception handler methods. Then how you are going to handle the exception? So you have to make sure the business logic is executed, handling with it multiple meaningful try-catch blocks only. Because you got arithmetic exception, you have 500 REST services. 500 REST services you got. Out of 500, which REST service is giving arithmetic exception? How can we know that? That is reason number one. Second reason. For one REST service, I have to give a different meaningful message. For another REST service, I have to give a meaningful message. The exception is same. Here I have to display like your interest amount should not be 0. Here I have to display like so and so, your year should not be 0. Then how can you manage? If you made as a global, every time it is displaying like value should not be 0. Which value? In a REST service of interest, it is interest value. In a related of something like year's point of view, year is a value 0. So that means you have to make sure based on the REST service implementation, there itself you have to manage the try-catch blocks. You have to write down the if-else conditions. And as part of if-else conditions, if value is 0, create new response entity. You got the point now? We written in the 2 days back. If-else 201 created, 200 okay. When user is not created. It's like that. When you got catch block, arithmetic exception, create an exception object there only. You can write down specific exception message, specific response message, create new response entity and send it back to the response. So that means in reality, we are not going to write most of the times controller advice classes. But if there is a chance, we will write down like this in case they are asking in interviews. It's very rare case. See, features are available. It doesn't mean like we are going to use always, right? So that is what. Sir, I have mailed the error, please. Yeah, Sumana, I'll try to connect with you today. I thought of connecting you yesterday. Probably I'll connect you afternoon. Okay, so let's see. I can see a lot of emails from you.